these grades aren't for students. They're for businesses, based on how likely the company is to pay its debts back. A company like Microsoft has the best grade possible, AAA, since they have a long history of paying people on time.
The internet is about driving profitability.
But a newer company like Tesla has a BB rating.
Fundamentally change the equation. You've got to have an all-electric vehicle.
And that affects their interest rates. Microsoft pays its investors 2.5% interest. Tesla pays a bit more at 5.3%. The riskier the grade, the higher the interest rate. But it's not just companies that have grades. Countries do too. The United States, for a really long time, had a AAA rating until
lawmakers have just 2 more days to raise the nation's debt ceiling and avoid a catastrophic
default on its loans, which could create turmoil in the U.S. economy and worldwide.
The U.S. has a weird thing called the debt ceiling, which is just a limit on how much debt the country can take on. If the national debt reaches that limit, the U.S. might not be able to pay its investors. The U.S. regularly comes close to hitting it, but the government always ends up raising it. Until 2011, when it almost didn't. After that, the U.S. was downgraded for the first time due to, quote, political risks. Since then, Congress and the president have had to raise it 7 more times. It's becoming an almost annual task. And of course, it always goes super swell.
The entire basis of the Republican strategy is we're going to shut down the government or cause economic chaos if we don't get 100% of what we want.
This isn't some damn game.
Our Republican friends need to stop playing Russian roulette.
Russian roulette with the economy.
In the last 20 years, the U.S. has borrowed more and more money. The national debt is at an all-time high. But how should we feel about this debt? And what happens if we don't pay it back? The U.S. national debt is nearing $29 trillion with a capital T. Depending on when you watch this, it might already be there. It's best not to look at it as a number, but instead as a comparison to the size of the economy. You'll see the U.S. takes on more debt when the country spends a lot, because of wars or because of investments needed during recessions, and now pandemics. And the department in charge of all this is the U.S. Treasury. They collect taxes and spend them to fund the government. And for the record, it's Congress and the president who decide how much taxes should be and where the money should be spent. The Treasury just handles the flow of money. But for essentially ever, they approve more spending than they bring in with taxes. So the Treasury has to make up that difference by taking on debt. And it does that by selling bonds. They can vary, but generally it works like this. You buy a $1,000 30-year bond at a locked-in 2% interest rate. Every year, the Treasury sends you $20, the 2% interest you've earned. And after 30 years, you can cash out the bond and get your $1,000 back. It's a win-win situation. The U.S. gets money to fund the government, and you make some profit on a safe investment. More than a third of these bonds, and therefore the total U.S. debt, are owned by Americans and American companies. Investors, and also banks, local governments, and even pension funds, keep their money in bonds. And the largest part is owned by the federal government. The federal government owns part of the federal government's debt. The money for Social Security is actually kept in bonds. So is the money for Medicare and federal pensions. The Federal Reserve has bonds too. Foreign investors only own a quarter of the U.S. debt. And while Chinese investors used to have the largest share, Japanese investors actually own more now. They own around 4% of all U.S. debt. And it is a lot of debt. Of all the developed countries, the U.S. has the 4th largest debt compared to the size of the economy. So is this bad?
The really, really frustrating answer is we don't know.
Debt has pros and cons. One question is, what are you doing with the debt?
When you're in an economic recession or an emergency, not only should you borrow, you should borrow a lot. But what you shouldn't do is borrow when your economy is strong and the political inconvenience of paying for things is too high.
Another really important question is, what are interest rates? In recent years, interest rates have been very low. That tends to make it easier to borrow and to sustain that borrowing. Where we are now doesn't make me, as of now, very nervous.
I worry about the debt a lot more than he does.
While all countries take on debt, only these two have debt ceilings. Denmark's, however, is kept so high, they're not going to come close to hitting it. Unlike the United States, where the government is constantly having to raise the debt ceiling to pay for spending they already approved.
That's the big problem with the debt limit, is it's internally contradictory. The government passes a law that says you have to spend 10. It passes a law saying you can only collect 8 in taxes. And then it passes another law saying you're not allowed to borrow 2.
If the US does hit the debt ceiling, it would mean the Treasury couldn't issue any more bonds, so no more debt revenue. Taxes would still be coming in, but that's not enough to cover all these responsibilities. So maybe they stop paying federal employees or stop spending money for programs. But at some point, they won't be able to pay the interest to these investors or cash out Social Security bonds. That's called a default. It's never happened yet.
You couldn't do more to sabotage your financial system than default.
Interest rates could rise based on a reassessment that the United States was considerably riskier than people had thought before. When government bond interest rates go up, that usually means that other interest rates are going up.
If you borrow for anything, whether it's for a dishwasher, a car, college, or your credit card, that's going to become more costly. We're going to lose jobs. Wages won't go up as high.
We could be like these countries and just not have a debt limit, or have one so high it's never a threat to the economy. Because if Congress and the president really want to take on less debt, they can change the tax system or reduce spending.
The debt limit does make sense if you are a functioning Congress. You're saying we need to put in place some policy to make sure that we don't borrow more than we mean to, or we stop and we pause and we check on the borrowing. That certainly isn't how it is working.
The simplest thing would just be to repeal it and be like almost every other country in the world.
Even if the US never actually defaults on its debt, just the mere political fights and will they or won't they unease could make the United States a less desirable place to invest.
It's long been seen as this is kind of the safest asset that you can invest in. And so that's given the US a lot of advantages. But the more our political system is so polarized and dysfunctional, the more that it becomes a little bit questioned of whether the US should have the incredible advantage that it has thus far.
The relationship between bonds and our ability to fund reparations. One of the kind of interesting facts, let me share my screen. So they talked about tax revenue, right? So there's 2 ways the government funds things. The first is through tax revenue. So the government, taxes our income, taxes businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they use that revenue to fund government programs, to pay employees, etc. Now, whenever there's not enough tax revenue to fund government programs or government services, then the government issues bonds. It sells that to the open market, either to private entities, public entities, the Federal Reserve, the government's bank, or to foreign entities. And in exchange, they get capital back, which they can then spend on programs, right? Now, the cycle needs to be completed where the bonds that are sold to these public, private, foreign, and Federal Reserve entities, they need to be paid their interest payments on certain timescales. So when the government no longer can fund itself, it no longer is able to pay the interest on these bonds. It's also not able to pay for its services, that we take for granted, things like Social Security, things like, just keeping the lights on, in government functions. And so this graph right here shows the amount of tax revenue the government collects every year from 2012 to 2021. And right now it's about $4.1 trillion in 2021. So all the money that it collected from tax revenue is 4.1 trillion. Now, even if it spends all 4.1 trillion to fund the government, there's still services that the government runs that it doesn't have tax revenue to pay for. So that's why, again, it will sell bonds in order to fund this. But its ability to sell bonds is limited based on the debt ceiling. Right now, the national debt is at 31.42 trillion, and the national debt ceiling is basically 31.4 trillion. So that's why Thursday is the big day where there's no amount of money the government can raise because it will not be legally allowed to sell bonds to continue paying for these services. So that's kind of like how the piping of the government works. And I'm going to get into later about like why this is connected to reparations again, but just understanding that the relationship between our national debt and the ability to, continue to sell bonds to the open market to finance the government, that's kind of like where the debt limit comes in. Because if you don't increase the debt limit, you can't sell more bonds to fund the government, essentially. And you also can't pay back people who already have outstanding bonds, which, again, would affect people's faith in the government and, lead to a financial crisis. So this is the graph about, or not the graph, but the website about, this is the Treasury, U.S. Treasury Department website about the national debt. Here's what they say about the debt limit. They said the debt limit is the total amount of money that the United States government is authorized to borrow to meet its existing legal obligations, including Social Security and Medicare benefits, military salaries, interest on the national debt, tax refunds, and other payments. The debt limit does not authorize new spending commitments. It simply allows the government to finance existing legal obligations that Congress and presidents of both parties have made in the past. Failing to increase the debt limit would have catastrophic economic consequences. It would cause the government to default on its legal obligations, an unprecedented event in American history. Essentially, it's never happened before, right? That would precipitate another financial crisis and threaten the jobs and savings of everyday Americans, putting the United States right back in a deep economic hole, just as the country is recovering from the recent recession. Congress has always acted when called upon to raise the debt limit. Since 1960, Congress has acted 78 separate times to permanently raise, temporarily extend, or revise the definition of the debt limit. 49 times under Republican presidents and 29 times under Democratic presidents. Congressional leaders in both parties have recognized that this is necessary. Right, so that's coming straight from the Treasury Department and how they kind of view things. Now, let's go to the Constitution. There's two articles in the Constitution, or two sections of one article in the Constitution that are important. So, Article 1 of the Constitution outlines how money is spent and used in the United States. So there's Section 7 and Section 9 that outline it. So this is called the power of the purse. So Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Right? So this is going to become more important in terms of who has control of the House today in modern America, which is the Republicans, and then also who's the House Speaker, and that'll come more important as we read Janet Yellen's, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury's, her letter to the House of Representatives. So the second part, U.S. Constitution Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So those are the two important clauses and sections of Article 1 that relate to how money is used and spent in the U.S. government. Now, let's read what Janet Yellen wrote to the House Speaker. Now, again, since we know that the power of the purse kind of lies with the House of Representatives in Congress, and that, as we saw over earlier this month, the election of the House Speaker is the person who controls the House, essentially, and decides rules and appointments. So Kevin McCarthy, well, in the midterms, the Republicans won control over the House, which meant they had a majority, which helps them elect who the House Speaker is. So with their 218 majority, they elected Kevin McCarthy as their House Speaker. That's why Janet Yellen wrote this letter about reaching the debt limit on Thursday, tomorrow, to directly him, the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. So let's read it. So this was written on the 13th. So the Honorable Kevin McCarthy, Speaker, U.S. House of Representatives, Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. Speaker, Public Law 11773 increased the statutory debt limit to approximately $31.381 trillion on December 16, 2021. As you know, the debt limit is the total amount of money that the United States government is authorized to borrow to meet its existing legal obligations, including Social Security and Medicare benefits, military salaries, interest on the national debt, tax refunds, and other payments. I am writing to inform you that beginning on Thursday, January 19, 2023, the outstanding debt of the United States is projected to reach the statutory limit. Once the limit is reached, Treasury will need to start taking certain extraordinary measures to prevent the United States from defaulting on its obligations. Now, the next part talks about what her plan is to prevent this happening if the House of Representatives does not increase the debt limit by end of day Thursday. The two extraordinary measures Treasury anticipates implementing this month are: one, redeeming existing and suspending new investments of the Civil Service Retirement and Disability Fund, CSRDF, and the Postal Service Retirement Health Benefits Fund, Postal Fund. And two, suspending reinvestment of the Government Securities Investment Fund, G-Fund, of the Federal Employees Retirement System Thrift Savings Plan. So what those two things say in short are, mainly this is going to hurt people who are government employees or receive government benefits, right? They're going to try to basically stop the payment on these certain bills in order to prevent that money from being reaching the debt limit, essentially, or exceeding the debt limit. So Congress has expressly provided Treasury with authority to take these actions, and prior Treasury secretaries have used these measures, which will reduce the amount of outstanding debt subject to the limit and temporarily provide additional capacity for Treasury to continue financing the operations of the federal government. After the debt limit impasse has ended, the CSRDF, Postal Fund, and G-Fund will be made whole. Essentially, they're saying after the debt limit is increased, the funds that are being postponed in terms of the payments, they'll not only be made whole, but they'll be paid with interest. Presidents and Treasury secretaries of both parties have made clear that the government must not default on any obligation of the United States, and As noted, Treasury secretaries in every administration over recent decades have used these extraordinary measures when necessary. Yet the use of extraordinary measures enables the government to meet its obligations for only a limited amount of time. It is therefore critical that Congress act in a timely manner to increase or suspend the debt limit. Failure to meet the government's obligations would cause irreparable harm to the U.S. economy, the livelihoods of all Americans, and global financial stability. Indeed, in the past, even threats that the U.S. government might fail to meet its obligations have caused real harms, including the only credit rating downgrade in the history of our nation in 2011. That's when we went from a AAA rating to a AA rating in terms of credit worthiness. Increasing or suspending the debt limit does not authorize new spending commitments or cost taxpayers money. It simply allows the government to finance existing legal obligation that Congresses and presidents of both parties have made in the past. The period of time that extraordinary measures may last is subject to considerable uncertainty due to a variety of factors, including the challenges of forecasting the payments and receipts of U.S. government months into the future. While Treasury is not currently able to provide an estimate of how long extraordinary measures will enable us to continue to pay the government's obligation, it is unlikely that cash and extraordinary measures will be exhausted before early June, which is kind of like basically saying the deadline that they can continue holding off the CSDRF fund, the postal fund, etc., would be until like early June. Consistent with past practice, I will, of course, continue to keep Congress informed as we approach the exhaustion of our resources. I respectfully urge Congress to act promptly to protect the full faith and credit of the United States. Sincerely, Janet Yellen. And they basically mention who else it was sent to: the House Democratic leader, the Senate Majority leader, the Senate Republican leader, the House Committee on Ways and Means, the ranking member of the House Committee on Ways and Means, chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance, and the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Finance. So that's who it was CC'd to, in addition to the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. So let's open it up to discussion. The last thing I'll say is basically, usually there is some political infighting that happens, and then the government usually comes to a compromise where they increase the debt limit, or like Janet Yellen suggested, that it's temporarily suspended. I think the most important thing to understand is not only how the government functions, but in terms of how money is spent and paid for, or created in general, but also understanding how this conversation will ultimately influence reparations. Even if you take Darity's plan of like paying $1 trillion a year for about 10 years, about $1.4 trillion a year for about 10 years, this will have to be done in the context of the debt limit. So, for example, let's say a bill is passed that approves like $14 trillion, $1.4 trillion a year in spending for reparations based on Darity's plan, right? In the context of that, as that money is doled out every year for 10 years, $1.4 trillion at a time, if the debt limit is hit again, it will need to be increased before those reparation payments can continue to go out. The good side of this is that the government bonds are like the most trusted investment in the entire world, and so people not only buy it but they understand that the government will pay its debts, and they will continue to get their interest payments, and they can't discriminate about which government programs they'd like to fund or not to fund. So they can't say, well, I don't want to support reparations, therefore I'm not going to buy the reparations bond. No, they're all sold as U.S. Treasury bonds, and you can't literally discriminate between which bond will fund which program or not. All the money goes to the Treasury Department to fund the programs. So with that, let's open it up to discussion. How you doing, Inspired Native? Shauna R. I'll send some more mics out.
I'm good. I'm gonna finish this mommy time, and then I have something to add to that.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Keep raising them freedmen. Native, you want to go next, and then we'll go to Shauna.
Hey, what's up? I don't have anything to add at this point.
Yeah, no worries. How about you, Shauna?
No, I don't have anything to add at this point either. Thank you for basically reiterating how the whole debt limit works and bonds, and it helps drive the point home. So thank you.
Definitely, and actually, yeah, you were in that space last week that we went over how it works, and I talked about, in terms of the numbers, it was like 31.3 trillion was the national debt, and the debt limit was 31.4 trillion. So that was only $100 billion that the government had left to spend. And I said something like, it's going to hit that by the end of the year for sure. It just came a lot earlier than expected. So literally like a week later. So let's go to Native. You got your hand up, and then we'll go to Label.
Yeah, so we are all proceeding with accepting that this debt is valid and it's real, and they're making this about this is out thin air, and that all of this is a fraud, right? So we just gonna ignore that.
Say that one more time.
All this stuff, this money is a fiction. It does not exist.
I mean, all money is invented, but there is something that's important to financial stability and a government that can fund itself. So, for example, let's bring up the example of reparations again. I talked about the two ways the U.S. government funds itself is by raising taxes or by issuing bonds. So the government, like I said, in 2021 raised $4.1 trillion in tax revenue. That's not enough to fund all of the government's operations and services and to pay all of its employees and things like that, right? And all the pensions and things. So what it does is it sells bonds to the open market in exchange for dollars that it then can continue to fund its government services with, right? Now, what happens when people lose trust in the U.S. government's ability to pay the interest on the bonds that they buy? Then that means essentially you get less buyers willing to buy bonds in the future, which means that ultimately a government can find itself in a position where it can't raise additional revenue by selling bonds because no one wants to buy them. Now, the one thing that the United States has going for it that a lot of other countries don't have is that we have the reserve currency of the world, and we have the Federal Reserve, which can issue virtually any amount of money to pay the bonds by crediting the Treasury Department's account. Now, the only problem with that is, again, this debt limit. It can only issue, the Federal Reserve can only issue the amount of money that the debt limit would allow. So that's kind of like the inner workings that we have to kind of understand. So, Inspired, did you want to say something before I go to Label?
No, you can go to label.
Okay, go for it, label.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, see, this is the thing. Once we understand that the whole market system, this is why reparations is really important, because once we understand that the whole market system was created behind enslaving people, then we can understand why the borders are open the way they are, because the land, there's so much land that's being sold to China, Ukrainian, all across the world, right here in America. There's so much land being sold. And the reason why these people are coming in, the way they're coming in, because this is how the country was founded, on the backs of enslaved people. So guess what? The land is the reparative repair that is needed for our people. This system it's been going on like this for this is not new. We're all looking at this as if this is a new situation, a new issue. This has been going on. What's happening now is that people are awakening. So guess what? There was one time when Trump said, you know what? We don't, anybody without a college degree to get a government job. What he was doing was exposing the system. And he was exposing what was actually happening, and it blew past a lot of people's heads. So the land that's being bought in person by foreign entities that are in cahoots with American corporations. This is why the black farmers are receiving what they're receiving. This is why it's going on, because there are people willing to work for nothing to buy into that system. Okay, so that's
one of the interesting things is when we talk about this in our policy, our Friedman agenda in terms of reparations. Now, reparations not only includes compensation, but it includes restitution, which is the return of land, including the 40 acres that we were promised in Special Field Order 15, as well as in the Freedmen Bureau Act. It also includes rehabilitation, it includes satisfaction, and it includes discontinuation, basically guarantees of non-repetition of the harm, which is critical. If you think about it in the context of Reconstruction in 1865, with the passing of the Freedmen's Bureau Act and the Freedmen's Bank Act, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments later, and the ratification, those were an attempt at reparations. However, they failed the ultimate test of those 5 parts, because after 1872, when the Freedmen Bureau was destroyed, and 1874, when the Freedmen Bank was robbed, not to mention, the eviction of our 40 acres, all of that rolled back not only the compensation and the restitution, but it also didn't meet the satisfaction, right? And it didn't meet the discontinuation, because for 100 years after that, not only did they have to experience that up to the civil rights, but we're still experiencing acts of genocide to this day. So in terms of making sure that a reparation plan is successful, it must include land as well as cash payments and these other forms that are part of reparations. So I definitely want to make that clear. The key insight here is the U.S. is in a very unique position in terms of its ability to um, kind of finance itself through bonds because people want to buy them. Now, excuse me, take North Korea for example. I don't even think they have a bond market in the way that we think about it, right? Because no one really wants to buy North Korean bonds, right? No one really wants to be seen kind of cooperating with them. At most, maybe China may be in terms of its complicity in supporting them, but in terms of there's no global market willing to fund, the building of bridges in North Korea or things like that. That's what government bonds for the U.S. are able to do. And it's going to be the system for how we fund reparations as well. Both our plan includes the use of bonds, and even Marcel's plan even more directly uses bonds to fund reparations. So, based on the level of cost that reparations will require of the U.S., bonds are the only sensible way to pay for it without needing to raise taxes. So just want to make that clear. So yeah, it's super important that the U.S. pays its debts, continues to pay its interest on bonds. Also, that we increase the debt limit in a reasonably quick time. People around the world are looking at what the U.S. does in order to decide where they'll put their money, which again helps finance government services. So it is a virtuous cycle. The more trustworthy we are as a government and as a group of people that represent this government, the better we're able to run the government because we're able to finance things without any hiccups, so to speak. But yeah, let me go back around and see. Inspired, did you want to add anything, or Sean? And then I'll try to send out some more mics.
So just so I can understand, I was just I put in the jumbotron. It probably isn't sure to get just the background, just some documentation on what the bond. This is so important for us to understand of this process, because this is what we're going to have to be able to articulate when we're advocating for reparations. So I'm so glad you decided to do Debt Limit Thursday. I love it. This should be something that we should do all the time and talk more about it, because we have to be financial. It has to start from the cradle to when we leave this earth. Excuse my grandbaby in the background. But we have to be able to have it all planned. We don't need financial education. We have everything in our system with the Freedom Party to educate ourselves on the system that is going to be paying our reparations. So I say that to say that now I have a question. Texas has introduced a bill. I think it's 147 is the number, but they've introduced a bill to limit outside countries from buying up land in Texas. Now, foreseeing that outside governments going to have the ability to buy bonds, is the debt ceiling and outside countries buying land in our country, is that connected?
It isn't, but I do agree with Texas's decision, and that connects to what Label was saying as well. I don't think we should be selling land. Land is extremely valuable, and you shouldn't, a government selling land. I'll just give examples. China uses its new technological and military power to finance governments around the world, and part of their bargaining is that they install military bases wherever they make an investment, essentially. And that's essentially the acquisition of land, right, which then gives them a toehold in terms of having military power and a sphere of influence to kind of make sure that what they want goes, right? So when you think about it in the context of the U.S., you don't want, whereas there's a quarter of our bonds are owned by foreign entities, and they said 4% by Japan and 3 point something percent by China. You don't want that equation happening in land. You don't want foreign governments. That becomes colonization fairly quickly. And and even in the context of bonds, you also want to be careful of who you even allow to buy your bonds. Like a lot of the sanctions on Russia is limiting its ability and its citizens' abilities to invest in foreign markets, whether that be buying U.S. bonds or buying bonds in Europe or buying bonds in other places or buying securities like Microsoft and Amazon and all these types of companies. So the way money works is super important that not only we understand it internally, but also understand how the global market works so that we realize not only the position that the U.S. holds and we hold as citizens of this country, but then understand how power is balanced throughout the world and how things can tip the balance of power, so to speak. So yeah, it's super important. I think the more we understand this, the stronger our reparation plan gets. When you understand how we can finance it with bonds, and then you understand the politics of the debts, the national debt, and the debt ceiling, it allows you to kind of weave a plan that can succeed because it's aware of all of the pitfalls and potholes of how things are paid for and how things are approved legislatively.
Just, as I'm like becoming full circle in the reparations movement, and the entity of chattel slavery laid the foundation illegally with human trafficking of America. With reparations, we are going to do the same thing. If you look at the debt ceiling and how the infusion of our money that is owed to us will come back into, because I know the concern is, will we be able to pay the interest? Freedmen, this is our country that we buy into, we invest into, and we live into. We're one of the only groups that have no other home country to invest in. This is our home. This is the country that we are going to invest in. So I am so excited that you explained this, because it makes even more sense about how we are going to again save America and undergird financially this country. It's amazing.
Yeah, and actually, just to add to what you said, you can think of the reparations payments that will be made with the selling of bonds as a representation of our share of this country, right? Like bonds represent ownership in things. You sell bonds to finance bridges, you sell bonds to finance highways, to finance, Social Security, Medicare, all these different things that are beyond the taxpayer bill. And the other thing that's really interesting about bonds and how we can finance the government again and finance reparations is that there's no way for them to discriminate against us in that way. Because again, they have to buy the bonds. And again, it's not bonds for reparations, bonds for, this service or this government program. So they can't discriminate. They either have to decide we're not going to ever buy government bonds again, which they'll never do because it's the best investment in the world. And, this idea that the Federal Reserve can also be the issuer of the credit needed to buy the bonds. The Federal Reserve is the government's bank. And during COVID, when they issued about $14 trillion, the same amount of money that Darity had calculated a few years ago for reparations, that was paid for primarily, like most of it was paid for by the Federal Reserve typing into a computer and crediting the U.S. Treasury Department in exchange for those government bonds. So the Federal Reserve has trillions of dollars of not only government bonds, but stock in private companies on its balance sheet. So there's a very interesting way in terms of understanding. Once you understand the full mechanics, it allows you again to, basically create a fundable and sustainable reparations program. So I think it's important for that reason. Also, Label, shout out to you. I like that you shared that Forbes article. America's first bond market was backed by enslaved human beings. And actually,
Come on now.
yeah, and actually, just to add to that, in 1860, this is actually when the calculations we use for reparations. So in 1860, 4 million of our ancestors were valued at $4 billion. So we actually did two things. Last year, what I did is I took that number, 4 billion in 1860, and I ran it at 7% interest, which is the inflation adjusted return of the stock market since its inception in like 1790, as well as the charter of the Freedman Bank had 7% as the interest that should be paid annually. So if you run 7% on $4 billion, you get $246 trillion today in terms of the value of our ancestors' labor and skills. Now, the entire U.S. wealth is something like 270 something trillion. So it's basically like almost 80% of the U.S. wealth is locked into what our ancestors did. Now, the other thing I did recently is I got a different calculation. If you take 4 billion in 1860 and you divide it by 4 million, of our ancestors, that's about $1,000 per the value of one of our ancestors. Now, if you run $1,000 at 7%, you get an even higher number than the amount of money due based on the 246 trillion. So if you do 246 trillion and you divide it by 42 million, you get about 6 million per freedman. If you take $1,000 in 1860 per one of our ancestors and you run that at 7%, you get $61 million today. So they were valued at the modern day equivalent of $61 million. And that's, again, like far higher than the calculation if you just run it on 246. And the reason that you get a different calculation is because back then it was 4 million of us, right? Now it's 42 million. So you're, instead of dividing that 246 trillion over 4 million, you're dividing it over 42 million. Whereas if you keep that 1-to-1 ratio over 1,000 per person and just run interest on that, you get the number that it would be today. So either way, understanding the value of not only how markets work, but these people, they kept receipts that only serve us in terms of being able to calculate what we're owed. I remember when I first started looking at calculations, one of the first questions you get is like, oh, well, how will we ever be able to figure out what people are owed and blah, 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 blah. It's actually fairly easy to figure out what we're owed. And you can do it from multiple sources. You can take the Compensated Emancipation Act. They valued us at $300 in 1862. You run that at 7% interest, it's $16 million today. So unfortunately, they paid the $300 to the slave owners, and actually there was about 3 slaves to every owner. So they actually got paid the modern day equivalent of $45 million per slave owner, right? And so all of these things are either in legislation or in some form of like a bill or a bill of sale, like a receipt. So they've left receipts and proof everywhere that we can use. So it's extremely helpful. I think Inspired, she was looking at a sale of one of her ancestors, right? And I forget the exact number, but I remember whatever software you were using, it wasn't using 7% as the interest. And I ran it at 7% and it was like $75 million in today's money. And funny enough, it's equivalent to the Garrison Frazier. He bought his freedom for $1,000 in 1857 for himself and his wife, which is $75 million in today's money. But I think at the time that your ancestor was sold, it was like a few years early, like 1852, was it, or something like that?
He was sold for $655 in 1851.
1851. So yeah, that amount of money in 1851 is equivalent to $1,000 in 1857. That's another way to think about it. But the modern day equivalent is $75 million. So all of these things help serve as proof. And the fact that she has like actual proof and evidence of that is just incredible. The sad part in all of these is that the money goes to other people, which is the insane part, right? So, yeah. Any other? Yeah, keep on.
No, I just think that's amazing. Thanks, Lava, for actually putting that documentation about the stock market was backed by, our ancestors, the enslaved people. Because a lot of times people don't understand how directly, currently, right now, the recycle of the wealth in this country has been literally on the backs of freedmen. And I shared in the Jumbotron, my ancestor, but don't, that trick bag of we can never find out, or it's not related to current, that's a lie and it's a trope. And it's equivalent to, they didn't want us to learn how to read. But now we know how to read, and we also know how to do math.
Exactly.
Brother Freeman, they got the situation going, but I appreciate the mathematics because I learned that too. But I'm saying it's right. You're exactly right, and everything is been saying. And here's another point that I want to make is that we gotta understand that we're having these issues, with classification issues, districting issues, what I'm saying? Like they're doing in Maryland. I mean, right now, Maryland. Actually, Maryland, I'm from Maryland. I was born and raised in Baltimore. And the thing is, they are trying to same thing is going on in Alabama. And basically to black culture. But as freemen, we have a war going on, not necessarily a physical war, but a war going on with a whole lot of different entities. Corporate entities have taken over our civilized society. With a lot of our people, they are descendants of those too. A lot of our stand on that too. So yeah, the numbers matter, the math matters, all of that matters. This is, I'm 45. I've been doing this 25 years, so I'm glad, I'm ecstatic that this movement has caught fire again, because the last I remember was 1995. So I appreciate the numbers and
definitely.
The numbers. Yeah, what I'm saying? So I did it. I grew up freedmen. I grew up around great grandmothers, great grandfathers. So the idea, the status of freedmen was a thing. It was a thing. It was for real. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't just a term. It was something for us to, for me.
Definitely.
It was something for me. Yeah, it was something for me to build on, grow on, get to my lineage, get the understanding what really had happened. So the more that I grow in that understanding, because every day is a growing process. I'm on the ground. I do blueprint and construction and building and all that for a living. I have my own business, all that. But as far as the movement, I'm in Oklahoma right now. We fighting a whole lot of, not necessarily fighting, but we're fighting a whole lot of people.
Hey, label it. You'll like this. When you brought up the descendants from the 5 tribes that are freedmen, you reminded me of this tweet from a day ago. Marilyn Vann, she actually, she's like a freedman from one of the 5 tribes, and she was just in Congress last year talking on behalf of them to get their citizenship back in the 5 tribes. And they're meeting in Oklahoma, of all places, right? On the 21st of this month. I just put the tweet. I put the tweet in the jumbotron. So if you're able to, you should be able to link up with them.
Absolutely, I'm gonna check it out. And we got, like I said, we had Blackstone in Mexico. Look what happened there.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I think the most important thing we can understand, like you said, is like we are freedmen, and if we are able to steep ourselves in our history and honor our ancestors by continuing their work, like when I think about reparations and think about like when were we best off, I honestly think it was post Reconstruction. Like the only difference between then and now is technology, but in terms of what we had, our institutions and things like that, like we were going in the right direction. And if the U.S. had stayed on that path, really the only difference between now and then would be technology, right? We would have the institutions, we would have the Freedmen's Bureau, we would have the Freedmen's Bank, we would have had our 40 acres and all these things, right? So really, we need to recover what happened during Reconstruction. The Civil Rights era recovered the ability to vote, but beyond that, and like a few things with housing that they still discriminate on, we didn't get back the institutions. So our job is to get back the institutions now that we can vote again, right? From Reconstruction, 1865 to 1965, there was like 100-year gap of like voting, right? Like they couldn't vote, even though we had 2,000 freedmen in elected office post Reconstruction, right? So that wasn't replicated until 100 years later. Now we have the ability to vote, but we haven't been exercising it for our own will. We've been using and giving it to political parties that were not founded with our interest at heart. And so if we're now able to take our ability to vote as freedmen, create a voting bloc through a political party, then also raise up candidates from the grassroots, freedmen candidates, that we then vote for to get into elected office, and then give them the actual freedmen agenda, the policy that we want passed. All they then have to do is vote on it, right? And so that's really how we get things done and get back to everything we need in terms of finishing Reconstruction, getting the Freedmen's Bureau, the bank, the schools, the hospitals, the courts, getting reparations, which includes restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and discontinuation. And then last but not least, genocide prevention. And genocide includes the stopping of lynchings and massacres, physical and mental harm, apartheid, extermination, and family separation. So that's kind of like our big agenda and our goal for the party in terms of what we want to accomplish. And even once we accomplish it, the job won't be done. Our job will be to ensure that reparations payments continue to go out, that discontinuation does not happen, right? That genocide prevention is enforced, and that our freedmen institutions, again, continue to survive. So there will be a lot to keep going, and new things that we will add to our agenda that will need to be pursued. So yeah, we've reached our hour, so I do want to start wrapping up. Tomorrow we will be back 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 Eastern. The topic we'll put out shortly, but I kind of wanted to, we were initially going to do today's topic on Thursday, but I wanted to do it a day early to give people a little bit more of a heads up. So like from tomorrow onwards, you're just going to get a flood of news about the debt ceiling, and at least you'll have context and understanding like what's going on. And it won't be this kind of like weird, obscure thing that sounds like irrelevant. Like, okay, well, why should I care? So this will put everything in context, hopefully, for you and give you some grounding and understanding, and also make you think about reparations and how we can use, again, bonds to fund reparations, and then how we'll use the debt limit and the national debt as a way to make sure that our reparations is paid for in a smooth fashion. But yeah, with that, unless there's any last thoughts, I'll start to close out. Inspired, any last thoughts, Sean R?
Yeah, I just wanted, I did post the last thing in the Jumbotron is the maturation that you did on my ancestor, that we came up with the 75 million. So this is Trace Your Lineage Challenge that the Freedom Party has put out. I was putting some information out. And I did it without interest. This was a probate document that we found, which means somebody died, and they were actually auctioning off the male slaves. In this document that we found, we were able to track our lineage to other plantations where his brothers were sold. And Ephraim is my direct line in my lineage, and that's how we came up with it. And when the Freedom Party did the 7% interest, it showed that the wealth that was instituted by this probate hearing that was sold to the other plantation, that family, when this person died, Osset, 75 million is what my ancestor in today's market, that's the wealth that was instituted into that family. So it's really great that we know that Trace Your Lineage Challenge post those things. It's important that we grab those documents and hold on to them. And that's all I have to say. Great space. I understand. So now I can kind of have a good conversation about the debt limit.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I love that. And totally, I really appreciate you sharing your story. You know, those things aren't easy to share, and they can be uncomfortable to even learn. But it is courageous, and it helps us put things into context. And just imagine if that wealth, instead of being traded between slave owners and other people, was given to your ancestors and was able to earn interest over the last 150 plus years. That would be incredible, and it would be worth something equivalent to 75 million. And think of these things as like net worths. If I'm, again, like in a crude way, they're saying, okay, if I'm willing to sell you for X amount of dollars, that's someone's, like, so to speak, net worth. And those numbers seem small in 1851 dollars, but when you look at it in 2023 dollars, $75 million is a lot of money. So you can imagine yourself being worth $75 million. Like, damn, I wish I had $75 million to pull for you.
He was 17, so just think about the amount of work
right.
that he worked for free all of those years and was being sold to another plantation
right.
to be owned in 1851. So that's great. Right. And these are things that we have to start pushing. This is our truth. It's not replacement theory. This is our truth.
Exactly. And what's so beautiful about it is at least we have the proof, and we can kind of like see through time. This is our time machine. Like, interest is our time machine, and we can kind of see what things were actually, what they're really worth. And kind of, because when most people see these numbers, they're like, okay, $100 or this dollar is like, oh, I know how much money that is. But when you really look at what that money meant then and how much you could buy with then and how much that person is worth in modern terms, it really sheds a light on things. But yeah, thank you again for sharing.
Oh no, and don't let nobody tell us that we need financial literacy before we get no check. We have it all in-house, okay?
Exactly. That's part of their real fear. They know that if we get it, because I always go back to the Freedmen Bank thing. Think about it. From 1865, like, the Freedmen Bank was passed the same day as the Freedmen Bureau, March 3rd, 1865. You're going to hear me say this date a lot. I think it should be a holiday. But March 3rd, 1865, right? The Freedmen Bank is passed. 9 years later, 1874, they've saved 100,000 freedmen have saved up the modern day equivalent of $1.36 trillion. If you divide that by the number of freedmen that had accounts, that's about $12 million each, like on average, if you just like divided it equally. So that's incredible to think that they had the modern day equivalent of $12 million, 9 years removed from slavery. And so when Frederick Douglass says that the robbery of the Freedmen Bank was the equivalent of 10 more years of slavery, he wasn't lying. Not only had he gone through slavery and emancipated himself, but he understood that the fundamental idea behind slavery, beyond it being about physical punishment and all these other things, it's about economics and basically not paying you your wages and what you're owed in terms of your labor and your skills. So if you save up the equivalent of 1.36 trillion, $12 million each, and then that money is taken from you, that's slavery, because you worked for 9 years and then all of your income is just immediately taken away. That's the equivalent of not having been paid for those years that you put in all that work. That's slavery, right? So Frederick Douglass pointed it out. So when I just see just that one thing, and this is after the 40 acres were taken away, right? That they were still able to save up this amount of money. So, I'm extremely impressed with what our ancestors accomplished in such short time. And we are just as capable, and we have the access to technology and resources that they didn't have. So we can accomplish much more in a shorter amount of time if we're focused and put in the work. So with that, y'all, I really appreciate you coming. Check us out tomorrow. We'll be back 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 Eastern. Have a great day, and check out all the news tomorrow on the debt limit and debt ceiling, and you'll be astute and get to like lead all the conversations like, oh yeah, I know about that. But yeah, have a great day, y'all.